On the 4th of June, the results of the largest democratic election in history came to light. We are talking about India's general elections, in which 960 million people were called to vote. The results were surprising. Narendra Modi once again won the election, but with vastly less support than he had in the 2019 polls. For Modi, the economy was one of his main campaign issues, and no wonder. India is growing like crazy at an average rate of 6%. During his administration, important free trade agreements have been put in place, and what is more important for an election, major milestones have been reached, such as bringing electricity to 100% of households. However, it seems that the Indian population is quite disappointed. The election results are out, and what is worse, it seems that even Modi himself knows that the economic bonanza is a cow he can no longer milk. His rhetoric now focuses almost 100% on Hindu nationalism and his rejection of the Muslim population. The question is, do Indians really have reason not to be optimistic about their economy? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Since India liberalized its economy and opened up to the world in the 1990s in the style of China, they have continued to grow at an enviable rate. However, while China has grown at rates above 10% per year, India has lagged somewhat behind. And if we compare it with countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan, then India's growth is no longer so miraculous. And pay attention, because when it comes to economic growth, every decimal point counts. To give you an idea, the difference in the average growth rate between the US and Argentina has only been half a percentage point since 1945. Only half a point, and today the US is 3 times richer, no joke. And if that wasn't enough, many suggest that it won't be long before the Indian economy begins to slow down. Of course, we aren't talking about a catastrophe. India will continue to be the world's fastest growing large economy, but what can I say? With half of the population still earning less than $3.65 a day, it's not unusual that many Indians are not too happy. So on Visualeconomik, we have asked ourselves some questions. Why is India still not a major power? Why has its economic growth failed to match that of China or South Korea? Well, let's find out. Some say that in China, everything works thanks to the government. In India, on the other hand, everything works in spite of the government. Of course, this is an exaggeration, but it does have a grain of truth. In India, the state does everything except help. Now, I'm sure that many of you are already thinking that India has a gigantic state with lots of state-owned companies that are very inefficient and survive by parasitizing the private sector, right? Well, no, nothing could be further from the truth. If the Indian state is a drag on economic growth, it is precisely because it is small, highly corrupt, and completely incapable of carrying out its most basic functions. And of course, not only does it not do its job well, but it doesn't let others do theirs either. But let's take things one step at a time. China has 57 public employees per 1,000 inhabitants, the US 77, Norway 157, and India, how many do you think India has? Only 16. In India, there is a lack of civil servants, but we aren't talking about the kind of civil servants who are only available from 9 AM to 1 PM, not counting the coffee break, and that send you home because you have to fill out a form that you didn't know existed. We're talking about judges, policemen, and bureaucrats, the essential workers for a country to function and have infrastructure, security, and legal guarantees. The fact is that the origin of this problem lies in the roots of Indian society itself, the ethnic and federal division. India is an enormously multicultural country. Its constitution, for example, recognizes 22 official languages. And to manage such a vast and diverse territory, there was no other solution than to choose a highly decentralized federal model. The problem? Well, on paper, India is a federal state, but in practice, there are matters where it is so centralized that everything depends on the central government. For example, 97% of all fiscal spending is decided from the top. What's more, 85% of public employees work in the state or federal government, while in China or the US, this figure is 40%. In short, although India is a very fragmented and diverse state, it is also very, very centralized. Money matters are decided from the top. And do you see where the problem lies? It's very difficult to bring so many different people together. In order to manage public goods in an efficient way, it is necessary to create a kind of trust between everybody. Knowing that it's possible that today I pay money and you benefit, but that tomorrow it will be your turn to pay and you will not cheat. But with so much diversity and with the historical burden of the caste system, this is very complicated. On top of that, such a weak state, distant from the local community, ends up being cannon fodder for corruption.
Indian politicians have fallen prey to cycles of corruption in which companies bribe leaders in exchange for favors, with leaders then using the money to fund expensive campaigns that involve, in effect, bribing voters.
And don't imagine that this corruption ends in secret pacts between politicians and big businesses. Corruption has penetrated all layers of society. It's not uncommon for a traffic warden to stop you and ask you if you can give him some money for a coffee, which is more a threat than a request. Even among ordinary citizens, it's estimated that 30% of driver's licenses are fake. In other words, the problems of the Indian government have become the cultural problems of the entire population. However, the cultural problems do not end here. The caste system, although formally abolished, is still very present. But there is also another big problem: machismo. Women make up 48% of the population, but contribute only 17% of the entire GDP, compared to 40% in countries such as China. In fact, 30% of Indian youth are NEETs. That is, they are neither studying nor working. But if we separate all young people by gender, NEETs only comprise 11% of men, compared to 40% of women. The bottom line is that half of the population, women, barely contribute, which partly explains how the world's most populous country has such a low GDP. The question is, why don't women work? Well, first of all, because there are rigid gender roles that prevent women not only from working, but in many cases even from leaving the house. They don't receive the same education as men, and even suffer wage discrimination that makes it unprofitable for them to go to work. But even if they tried, it wouldn't do them much good. India has a huge problem with its labour market. Unemployment is soaring at 7%, which may not seem much, but for such a poor country, it's a huge burden. Companies are absolutely incapable of growing. In fact, the average size is only 2 workers. And so, 80% of Indians have to make a living as best they can by becoming self-employed or working under the table. And this explains why labour problems are one of the main reasons why young people have lost faith in Modi. The question is, don't young people study? Don't they want to work? Nothing could be further from the truth. The real problem is that half of the university degrees have no job opportunities. And no, it isn't that suddenly everyone has decided to study the history of philosophy. It's that the curricula of many technical studies are completely outdated, and even when they do have a good syllabus, it's quite common that the professor never shows up to teach. According to a study, teacher absenteeism in public schools ranges between 20 and 40%. Why is this? In fact, India is one of the few countries in the world that pays its teachers better than other workers. The reason for this is what we have said before. The state is not capable of controlling its own officials, who are detached from the local community and susceptible to corruption. Knowing this, it isn't hard to believe that 50% of Indian youth in urban areas and a somewhat smaller percentage in rural areas are enrolled in private schools. According to several studies, these schools provide a somewhat better education for a much lower cost. To give you an idea, only 40% of 11-year-old children in Indian public schools can read in their mother tongue, and only 20% are able to perform simple divisions with 3-digit numbers. But it goes even further. Many public schools flatly refuse to teach English to their students. And why is that? Well, because the British Empire colonized India, and the politicians are so resentful that they ban English. Meanwhile, yes, in private schools, it's the most important subject. And now I ask you, how do you think the Indian government reacted to private schools taking the lead over public schools? Well, at first glance, not very well. It has dedicated itself to passing draconian regulations that practically force the centres to close.
Any school that does not meet this laundry list loses its recognition and may be forced to shut down. These regulations penalize low-budget private schools. Thus, an urban private school that may not have a fenced playground is forced to shut down even when parents have chosen that school over a free public school.
Now, did the politicians really seek to close private centres with these regulations? Well, probably not. Let me explain. We've already told you that the Indian state is small, corrupt, and very inefficient. If the government can't control driver's licenses or supervise whether its workers go to work, it would be normal for it to focus on solving those problems, right? Well, the Indian government doesn't think the same way. The government regulates, and regulates a lot. But the bad thing is not only that it has many laws, even though it has no police or judges to enforce them correctly, but that it imposes on a country that is still very impoverished. Regulations typical of a rich country. Do you want another example? Maternity leave. Under the latest law, companies with more than 10 workers must grant paid maternity leave of 26 weeks. Worldwide, only Canada and Norway, almost 10 times richer than India, are as generous with such leave. And why is this happening? For For some economists, the answer to this question is the key to India's failure. The elites are completely disconnected from the people. When we think of India, many of us think of highly intelligent computer engineers and CEOs of big companies like Google, Microsoft, and even OnlyFans. All these people, along with most of the influential politicians in the country, have grown up in very wealthy neighborhoods, which in reality are like those in any Western country. They speak English perfectly, they have studied advanced degrees, and in fact, some of these Indians speak only English. Their main source of information is not an Indian newspaper, it's the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Reports and proposed laws are written in English, and they spend more time talking to foreign entrepreneurs than to other Indians outside their bubble. The fact is that with the immense language barrier, along with the spectre of the caste system and the lack of a homogenous group of voters, the elites want to govern as if their country were the USA. And in saying this, we aren't saying that importing ideas and institutions from other more prosperous countries is a bad idea, but you have to have criteria and know which are applicable and which are not. The clearest case is that of the Indian judicial system. As a former British colony, India is governed by common law. It's a fantastic law, and we know that it was one of the factors that allowed the United Kingdom to experience the first industrial revolution. However, it's also a very extensive and complex law, and Indian courts are not able to cope with its enforcement. What you are seeing on the screen is a block of apartments that is falling apart. Its owner does not make enough money to fix it up, because his tenants have special rents inherited from the 1950s that are much lower than the market rate. Well, this landlord has been involved in legal proceedings for 50 years, initiated by his grandfather to see whether he can evict these tenants. And don't think that we are dealing with an isolated case. Cities like Mumbai have a real estate crisis perfectly comparable to that of London or Madrid. In fact, so little housing is built that each person has only 4.5 square meters on average. In many areas, rents have been frozen for decades, so cases like the one we just mentioned are very common. In others, prices are downright prohibitive. And not surprisingly, if you want to build new housing, it has to come with solar panels, be made with eco-friendly materials, and have its own water treatment plant. After all, these are the regulations we see in the world's leading cities, such as San Francisco, and those that the political elites are trying to implement. To give you an idea, it is estimated that lifting the most restrictive regulations could lower prices by 35% and boost supply by 75%, all without affecting really important things like infrastructure security. This would not only be beneficial because of the savings, but also because it would allow the rural population of the country to move to the big cities, where the factories and large companies are located. This is exactly what happened in China, where the government itself persisted with huge subsidies to build urban housing. However, still less than 40% of India's population lives in cities, and 20% of this urban population lives in slums that are basically shanty towns. However, the problem of applying rich country systems doesn't only affect the laws, because let me ask you, do you know any Indian companies? The truth is that there are large companies in the service sector, particularly in the technological field. We're talking about large consulting firms and companies in the world of finance. There is also Tata Motors, a big automobile company that has brands like Jaguar, and Suzuki also has a large Indian subsidiary. But apart from some fashion and cosmetics brands, such as Lakme, the truth is that not many examples come to mind. And the reason may be that India is a very strongly service sector oriented economy. In such a poor country, you would expect them to go into low value added manufacturing, which is much easier to master, and where it's easier to gain experience to develop your own industry, as South Korea did, and as China is doing right now. In contrast, manufacturing accounts for only 15% of India's GDP. It seems that here too, India has skipped steps on the development ladder and has gone straight for a model much more typical of a rich country. It's possible that part of the problem is what we saw before, the lack of an urban population capable of working in factories. Of course, not all countries have to follow the same path of economic development, but India's gamble on this model is undoubtedly quite risky, especially if we take into account that the way other countries have become rich is precisely through the manufacturing sector. But having come this far, now it's your turn. Can we talk about an Indian economic miracle? What do you think is the main obstacle for further increasing this country's economic growth? How will the country benefit from the new global geopolitics and the investment that is fleeing China? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best, see you next time.